Chapter 5. Though it was Sunday, Conrad rarely took the whole day to rest. Cattle didn't rest, so why should he? It wasn't as if they didn't need him. He had considered just staying home. But Ma expected everyone to ride to service together, piled in one wagon. As he strode to the front yard of his parents' house, it dawned on him. That would mean Izzy would also be riding with them. It had been a tight fit lately, with Lula so ungainly. Now they would practically be sitting atop one another. His belly tightened a bit. He didn't want Izzy sitting anywhere near his brothers, and certainly not that friendly. Izzy stood near the wagon, eyeing everyone piling in. Her glance slid around, and their gazes locked for a moment. There was only one person on that rig he had let anywhere near his lap, and she was so tiny there was practically room for two of her. Pa had the draft horses hitched to the wagon and was helping Ma up to her seat. Barton had climbed into the back and held on to both of Lula's hands as she carefully climbed up a few crates to make it to hers. Arnold and Eli followed, leaving him and Izzy the last few inches to squeeze into near the back on each side. Conrad reached the wagon in time to catch Izzy's worried look at the remaining space. He held out his hand to help her up the crates. "Don't worry. There will be room for you in the wagon, even if I have to walk or go saddle up quick." She was in the wagon bed by the time he had finished speaking, and Eli squished closer to Barton to give her room. "Eli, why don't you move next to Arnold and give her a little space, so our guest doesn't have to dangle off the end of the wagon?" Eli went red around the ears and stood, giving her his spot and moving next to Arnold. Now Conrad would have a good excuse to sit next to her. He hopped up the crates and into the back, settling himself next to Izzy. There wasn't much room. One good bump, and his Sunday best would hit the gravel. He draped his arm behind Izzy and gripped the side of the wagon. She didn't protest, but she also went rigid as an oak tree to keep from touching him. Her face held so much sadness, but he knew if he could catch happiness there, she would be far more beautiful than any woman he had ever laid eyes on. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she tilted her chin down toward him, taking him into confidence. "Would you walk with me later? Show me around the ranch a little?" She colored just a bit. "You did say if I needed anything I should but ask." He had said that, and he would do his darndest not to let it go to his head she was asking him and not Barton or Lula, whom she knew. "When we get back from the church picnic," he nodded. "Or will you be too tired?" She looked so peaked when he had found her the day before. Lula cleared her throat, drawing his attention. "Eli and Arnold, I'd like to introduce you to my closest and most dear friend, Izzy Lawson. She'll be staying with us until she tires of our company, so do your best not to wear her out too quickly. I'd like to keep her around a good long while." Barton squeezed his wife closer to his side. Though he worked hard all day, he was, after all, an Olson. He was distracted. Barton wanted to be with his wife every minute he wasn't working, often leaving chores early or delegating them to the hands. Her burgeoning size had only made it worse. Conrad leaned closer to Izzy. "We don't have to go today if it will tire you." She laughed. The first he had heard from her. "I wouldn't have asked you if I thought I wouldn't be able." He nodded, too pleased to trust his own throat with the words. The sermon would seem even longer than usual today. 4 hours later, Conrad waited in the sitting room for Izzy to come down. She had helped Lula up the stairs to lie down after the service and the picnic. Izzy had sat next to him during the luncheon affair, eating less than a bird, and nervous about every bite. She seemed to hide the fact she was eating at all, and finally he had just gotten up to give her some space. He prayed she'd take a few bites once he left. There had been little to talk about anyway. and now he worried their walk would seem just as strained. Izzy softly padded down the long staircase in her slippers and stopped at the landing. "I'm sorry that took so long. Lula was quite uncomfortable, and it took me longer than expected to help her. It appears I'm not well suited to helping women in pain." Since she wouldn't jump to her own defense, he needed to. "I don't think it has to do with you. I remember when Ma was going to have Barton. There wasn't anything that could make her comfortable near the end. She just toiled anyway. With 3 older boys, she couldn't take a break, and she never did get the help she was hoping for with the girl." Izzy's eyes flashed for just a moment. Then she tipped her head, hiding her face. "I should say she did. She has a daughter now that Lula is here." He hadn't really thought of Lula as a sister. A pretty distraction for his brother, but not a sister. "Where would you like to explore?" Izzy tilted her chin down and closed her eyes. He'd never just let himself talk with a woman like this, and watching every expression cross her face was like an explorer forging new territory. She was a beautiful, uncharted land to explore, and he loved every quirk of her pretty lips and dazzling eyes. "I think I'd like to see the pastures. The hills are so pretty, and nothing like what I'm used to. Moretta packed a supper for us in case we're out too late." He'd never heard anyone call his mother Moretta, and though he knew her name, it sounded so strange on Izzy's lips. "Ma packed a picnic?" He wouldn't complain, but 2 meals on the grass in one day was a little too much like traveling, something he never got to do and didn't really wish to. Her lip disappeared between her teeth for a moment. "If you'd rather not, I can just leave it. I'm sure I don't need any supper anyway." Land sakes! Why would she think he was trying to take away her meal? She could eat twice what was in that basket, and she'd still need to eat more to put a little meat on her bones. "I wasn't thinking anything of the sort. I just wasn't sure you wanted to be out long enough to need it. If you want me to keep you out that long, I'm sure I can manage." He tried to sound warm, welcoming. Talking to Izzy was like waltzing with a partner who only knew how to two-step, and he seemed to step on her feet often without trying. She turned, and he followed her to the kitchen. While it was the women's domain, he had grown up in that house, and it seemed as natural as breathing to follow her. She slid to a stop and angled her head back toward him in front of the door. Her eyes darted from his chest up to his face, and her mouth hung open slightly as her eyes widened. He backed away a step to give her room. Those amazing blue eyes still stared at him, with far too much fear than he ever wanted to see there. An urge to pull her close and protect her from whatever ghost haunted her slipped over him like a mantle. "I'm just going to get the basket. I'll be right back. You don't have to follow." He didn't feel like just waiting for her. He'd waited the whole time she had been helping Lula, and he was antsy to go. "It's no matter. I can get the basket and we can go out the kitchen door." Izzy hesitated for a moment, then pushed forward into the room just out of his reach. He followed her, grabbed the basket, and waited for her to put her bonnet on and tie it. As she tucked the wisps of hair by her face back under the fabric, he wanted to tell her just how pretty she was, but it wasn't his place to do so. Her hair was a gentle brown with just enough thickness to it that a man could lose his hands in it. Her nose upturned just a bit at the end, giving her a look of alertness to go with her blue eyes. Descending the back porch, they stepped out into the afternoon sun. His brothers would pick up the slack on this rare day that he wouldn't be working, and he refused to feel guilty about it. They had all done extra chores when Barton was at school for 3 years, and had thought he wasn't coming back. Now, Barton could shoulder a little more for an afternoon. Also, it would make up for the days he wouldn't work once his son or daughter was born. Conrad would work extra time to make sure Barton could spend time with the new babe. The pasture was so huge that none of the cattle were within sight. He lifted the metal C-ring holding the gate closed and let Izzy in, then followed, locking the gate behind them. While a pasture seemed an unlikely place for a stroll, he wouldn't complain. Izzy wandered toward a small copse of trees, and he followed her natural curiosity. That spot would make a nice place to sit for a while if she wanted to, once they reached it. Her shoulders were set, and she seemed to want to talk to him about something, though he couldn't imagine what. They had no history. Unless she had figured out it had been him who had carried her into the house, and she was embarrassed. But then why would she be out alone with him? Worry crept over him. If Izzy really had been asked by her friend to come teach him to read, as he suspected, he'd have to guard his words. Could she have asked him out here to corner him into admitting his failure? He lengthened his stride to catch up to her. "I've got to say, while I don't mind a bit taking you out here, the pasture is one place you're probably safe to explore on your own. A child might not be, but a woman full grown has the sense to stay away from the cows. You seem like a woman who's got plenty of sense." He kept watch on his feet, worried his words, as they so often seemed to, would bother her yet again. It wasn't until he had almost passed her that he realized she had stopped. "I could explore on my own, but I was hoping to go farther than just these little trees. It certainly doesn't seem as if you don't mind taking me. If being here with me has taken you away from something important, then by all means." Her shoulders slumped, and she turned back for the house, but her feet didn't move. He was too big to worry about walking on eggshells. They'd all crack anyway. "Miss Izzy, I don't know what makes you so sensitive to everything I say, but you shouldn't be. I haven't once thought poorly of you. In fact, I've had some rather nice thoughts of you." He took a step closer to her. "Like when you bout passed clean out into my arms as you fell off your horse, and I carried you into the house. That was probably the most pleasant thing that's ever happened to me. Best luck I've ever had." Izzy gasped and clutched her thin arms tightly about her middle. "I'm so sorry." She spun from him, but not before her face turned a beautiful shade of pink. "That must have been dreadful." Infernal woman, deaf as a stump. "Blast, woman, didn't you hear a word I just said? It wasn't dreadful in the slightest. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Want to go?" He took a step closer to her, only half joking. He would pick her up again and hold her close, but only if she had let him. She swung to face him, her eyes wide, her hand flattened against his chest, and he stopped immediately. "Conrad, you don't understand." Her beautiful lips parted as she sighed and backed away from him once again. "My husband told me the truth. What you see isn't. I'm not—" Her words died as she searched his face, but he couldn't help her. He couldn't find a fault with her. "I don't know what you mean, Izzy. I carried you. It wasn't about seeing anything except a woman who was going to fall in the dirt, and I wasn't about to let that happen." She huffed and gathered herself up straight. Somewhere inside that woman was a strong backbone that had been worn thin as a wheat stalk. But could she get back her pluck? "Let's go sit down under the trees for a minute. I need a rest." She turned and strode quickly away, much too quickly for a woman in need of a rest.